Okay. So one really simple grounding technique that we can do is just to put one hand on our heart and one hand on our belly and just kind of feel that containment and sort of energy flow between those two places. And you don't have to do any special type of breathing while you're there. But if you want to, if you notice that your breathing is a little shallow or that you're feeling some tension in your body, just stretch it out a little bit. And you can try to elongate your out breaths. So breathe in however is normal. And if it helps you, you can breathe out like this with a little ooh sound to slow down the out breath. So you breathe in however, and then continue for another 30 seconds at the pace that's comfortable for you. Just breathing slowly out. And, throughout the presentation, if you find that that tension or that anxiety is coming back, you can try some of those techniques to help bring you back into the present moment. And we do those things not just because of heavy topics, but actually in general, it's easier for us all to absorb new information or even information that is being reinforced if we have a little bit of relaxation in our minds and our bodies. It's just easier to pay attention and to focus and to absorb. So the topic of the evening is red flag, green flag, navigating early relationships. Relationship red flags is something that you may have seen or heard of before. It's a very common concept. There's all kinds of listicles online and in other places about what's a relationship red flag. And there can be a lot of variation in these. Sometimes the lists are talking about really severe kind of red flags where this is a red flag for abuse. This is a sign that most likely abuse is already happening in this relationship. And other red flags might be more subtle. They might be an indication that something could happen down the line, but more often they're about something that requires further examination in that relationship. And there can also be red flags that don't have to do specifically with abuse, but just have to do with being a healthy partner, right? Like red flags that have to do with being on the same page about things like monogamy and faithfulness or boundaries, or even things like having kind of balance between the intimate relationship and other like family and career responsibilities in your life. So a little reminder, and just to think about when we talk about red flags and green flags, it can sound really like you are sitting there with a scoreboard for your partner and you're kind of checking off, okay, have they done this thing? Have they done this other thing? Or that you're kind of adding things up and trying to do some sort of equation to figure out if this is a good relationship or not a good relationship. But it doesn't actually work like that, right? If that's how we operated when we were trying to enter into a new relationship, even a new friendship, or not just intimate partner relationships, but other relationships in our lives, this would make us feel really stunted and stiff, and it wouldn't allow for us to actually build a rapport with another person. So I want to allow space for that and say that the information that we're sharing is more about ways that you can check in with yourself about how you feel things are going and where you'd like things to continue going in the future, and less about like a kind of scoreboard or a do's and don'ts list that's going to be really clear. Relationships are somewhat a nebulous space for a lot of us. And although we can get more clear on who we are, what we want, and whether this relationship is likely to provide those things, there's still a lot of other factors at play. There's the attraction to the person. There might be other pressures or anticipation of wanting to be in a relationship. And there can be the fact that you really enjoy this person. You enjoy spending time with them. It's fun for you. Those are important things in a relationship. And when we're enjoying ourselves, we're not sitting back, checking off, did this thing happen? Did this other thing happen? So the first piece that I want to talk about when we talk about any kind of relationship red flags or green flags is that it's really helpful to think of these more so as signals than as kind of destiny predictions or life sentences. So with some exceptions, depending on how extreme a red flag is, it is not necessarily mean that if there's a red flag, your only choices are to either ignore it or to cut off the relationship entirely. It's more so that if you notice something that is a red flag, this is a time to maybe pause in the relationship, take some time to reflect and evaluate, and decide if you are going to proceed, what does proceeding look like in light of this red or pink or orange flag that cropped up. And same thing for green flags. Oh,
I was just gonna say, I think that the screen hasn't I don't. Yeah,
it hasn't
it's now
moved on
showing.
to the.
Yeah, now it moved to the reading relationship flags.
Okay, so it's on it now?
Yeah.
Okay, so I'll just allow that there's maybe a little delay.
Okay.
So sorry about that. But so as I was saying with red flags, that it's not necessarily that a red flag means that's it. Either you have to call everything off or you're just ignoring it and you're like being foolish for ignoring the red flag. It's also true that green flags are not like a prediction that everything is going to be great and everything's going to be perfect. It just means that these are some good things that are a good sign of what's going on in that relationship at the time and potentially what could happen in the future. It's also helpful to remember that signals apply to everybody. So I use this graphic of a traffic light to also bring up that idea of like slowing down, stopping, and moving forward, as opposed to like either get off the road or stay. And those are your only two options. But it's also helpful to remember that signals apply to all of us. So just as there can be red flags and green flags in our partner's behavior, there can also be red flags and green flags, not only in our own behavior, in terms of how we're interacting with our partner, but also red flags and green flags that we're getting from our emotions and our intuition. And it doesn't mean that our emotions are a dead accurate sign of whether something is good or bad in a relationship. A lot of us are coming into relationships with many perhaps previous bad interpersonal relationships. We're coming out of families where we didn't necessarily see healthy relationships modeled. And so the things that make us feel frightened or feel uncomfortable might not always match up with things that are actually dangerous or bad. But those things are still signals that we're receiving. And so when we feel uncomfortable or we feel afraid, that's a sign also for us to take a time to pause and evaluate what's going on. Am I feeling uncomfortable and afraid because of something this person is doing? Am I feeling uncomfortable and afraid because of something in my own past that isn't quite resolved? And if I don't resolve it, what is that going to mean for my relationship? And likewise, what does it mean to even stop and resolve that thing? Finally, I just want to point out that binaries tend to get us into trouble, whether we're talking about black and white or red and green. It's important to think of these signals as also occurring on a spectrum. Some of the examples that we're going to discuss, we can see that there are versions of that red flag behavior that are much more severe or serious or concerning than other versions of it. And the way you might respond to them are going to be different. So when you're in a relationship and you think that there's a red flag or a green flag going on, check in with yourself, like, how red is that red flag? Is it like a blinking siren telling you this is very dangerous and you need to really work on prioritizing your safety right now? Or is this more of something that is telling you to pause and reflect, and that if you would like to proceed, that you need to take some steps first to ensure that that red flag is not going to get any redder? And so while we're going through these examples of the red flags and green flags, please feel free to add in the chat other red flags that you've seen discussed online or that you've heard of that you'd like to hear more about. We might not get to all of them. I kind of selected some of the biggest main categories of red flag behavior, but I would like for us to at least address a few more, because there's not going to be any list of human behavior that's exhaustive, but we're more looking at kind of patterns and types of behavior that are either concerning or reassuring in the early days of a relationship. Are we seeing the next slide? No.
I think maybe press it in the audience window might work.
Do you see it now or no?
No.
It's so annoying.
Now.
Okay. Okay, there's just a delay.
Okay.
There's a button I need to use, so I'll just use that next time. And apologies for the technical learning that's happening while we're here. So one of the really key red flags that I think is important to discuss is this concept of love bombing. Typically, we would define this as somebody just like bombarding you with either gestures or gifts or words of affection very, very early in the relationship. And while that is something to be mindful of, I do want to highlight that there's a lot of different reasons why this can happen, or a lot of different reasons why we can engage in this behavior. Some neurodivergent folks, particularly people with ADHD, it's very natural for them to hyperfixate on something that's new, like a new relationship. And so it might not necessarily be an attempt to manipulate you or monopolize your time, but the behavior is still this kind of constant attention and constant focus on the new partner. And then moving to the other side of the spectrum, the people who are going to be bombarding you with these like intense gestures of love and affection, desires for commitment very early, are going to be people who have a lot of insecurity about relationships, who have a lot of issues feeling safe, being vulnerable in a relationship. And this is one of their ways to feel like they can be safe in a relationship. That is something that can be a problem as the relationship progresses, but not every person who does this behavior, just in the general sense of that hyper focus on a new partner, is necessarily going to be controlling or going to be abusive. That's where talking about the spectrum comes in. So I've highlighted the end of this. The beginning is your time together feels like almost constant, and that's also something that can occur on a spectrum. Like, is the time that you're spending with your new partner feeling like it's getting in the way of other things in your life? Are you canceling plans with friends that you were actually looking forward to? Are you missing out on things that are important and significant parts of your life in order to keep up with this demand for your time? Those would be some serious red flags, because now it's not just that both of you are so excited to spend time together that you're spending lots of time together. This is that the relationship is starting to crowd out other parts of your life. The second thing that could make it a red flag is that it feels difficult to turn down plans with the new partner. And it might feel difficult because you yourself have some anxieties about saying no to people or turning people down. And that's one of those self signals that's important to examine, because it's very hard to have healthy relationships, healthy boundaries in a relationship, if we don't feel able to say no or to let people down or disappoint people some of the time. But we want to look at how that person reacts when we turn down plans with them. Is it that when we turn down plans with them, they express some disappointment and they're sad, but then things generally proceed as usual the next time we get together? Or is it that after we turn down plans, they sort of turn cold, or they make accusations that you don't really care about them, you're not really interested or invested in the relationship? Those kind of things would be taking you further down the redder end of the spectrum toward a more serious red flag, that this is somebody who really wants to control your time and isn't able to accept when you have other priorities that don't involve them. Another big example that happens is overly extravagant romantic gestures and gifts. This is something that's going to be very different and very personal for different people. Some people love to exchange gifts. That's like normal for them. It's something that's within their budget, and so they're not feeling like beholden or like they owe the other person when they're receiving potentially expensive gifts. But for other people, receiving material goods early in relationship is going to feel really unbalancing and destabilizing. And so the key things that you want to look out for are whether this person respects what you have expressed about what you're comfortable with early in the relationship. Like if you've told them, if they brought you a gift and you told them, this is very nice, but I can't accept it yet, and they just kind of keep pushing, that's something to be concerned and mindful about. If you've told them that you would like to wait until a certain time period to exchange gifts or to receive like major kinds of material help from them, and again, they're not respecting that boundary, those are things to be concerned about. And then something to be really concerned about is if it feels like these gifts are indeed coming with strings attached, like you receive a gift from them, it's very nice, you appreciate it, and then very quickly they start complaining that you haven't given them a gift of that level or value, you haven't kind of performed on their level. That's something concerning, because if they were just giving you gifts early in the relationship because that's how they are, they're excited, they're generous, they want to give to you, then it wouldn't come with this kind of manipulation on the other side where, okay, I gave you this gift, now you owe me certain behaviors or commitments. Another thing that is important to keep in mind with the love bombing is if you notice that your sense of time regarding the relationship feels warped. A lot of people will say things like, oh, we've only been together like 3 weeks or 3 months, but it feels like so much longer. We just know each other so well. That's not always a bad thing. Again, like there are a lot of variations to love and romantic relationships. But if when you look at the calendar and you compare that to the progression of your relationship, it feels confusing to you, like how much time you've spent with this person, how far along you are in terms of the commitments you've made to them, how quickly the relationship is progressing, that's something to be concerned about. And I would say a red flag where you definitely would want to, at the very least, pump the brakes and and slow down the relationship and take some time away from the person so that you can start to recenter and feel like you are perceiving the passage of time normally as it's progressing, as opposed to feeling like when you're with this person, everything's moving kind of at warp speed. And I had bolded this piece about when gestures or gifts are followed by guilt or pressure to move faster in the relationship. That is a really serious red flag. Anytime somebody is hearing our resistance, our hesitation, our boundaries, and their response is not to understand them, to discuss them, to respect them, but to push or even to try to insinuate that you should feel guilty for not wanting to move as quickly as they are, that's a concern. I do want to make a distinction. It is obvious that there are many people out there who have different ideas of the timeline they want their relationship to be on. So somebody who says, you know, I'm really serious about marriage. If I don't see, if I would really like to be married like within the next year or 2 years. And if that's not something that's comfortable for you or a possibility as we discover, as we discover each other or after a certain point, then like I would like to move on. That's just that person stating kind of their preferences, their priorities, and their timeline. And we can accept that. We don't need to try to convince them that they should hang on longer, waiting for us to be ready. But if there is this pressure that you need to be ready on their timeline, that's something that we want to be concerned about. So every time we talk about a red flag, there's also green flags. So if you feel like the time that you spend together is enjoyable, but also optional, that's a good sign. That's a good place to be in a relationship. You are enjoying the time you spend together and you feel free to take it or leave it as the other priorities in your life dictate. Communicating changes or change of plans with this person is not stressful. Gifts and gestures are given freely and stop when either party expresses discomfort. And the pacing is decided mutually. We might not always be on the same page about what pace we want to go at, but if we're able to talk with each other about it and agree on a pace that feels comfortable for both of us, that's a good sign. That's a good foundation for communication in the relationship.
We had a question about the
Sure.
red flags. So it says, so when in the relationship that would be considered a red flag, sometimes it's just the beginning excitement of being into a relationship. I think it was about like gift giving and stuff.
Right. So that's why I was mentioning that it's okay to be excited about a new relationship and wanting to spend a lot of time with that person and wanting to give them gifts. When it becomes concerning is if we are completely losing track of the other priorities in our lives, or if we are not only disappointed when we can't spend time with that person or missing them, but starting to imagine that because they're not with us, they must be doing all kinds of bad things, or they must be involved with other people, or they must not care about us. Or if we are giving gifts and expecting that because we gave this gift, we are owed something from the partner, that's when it's concerning. Whether you're seeing this in your own behavior or in your partner's behavior, those are things that you would want to really address early on before getting deeper into the relationship. So are we able to see this next slide,
Yeah.
the red flag? So this is a really key one that, again, occurs on a huge spectrum. Jealousy is one of the many natural human emotions. In and of itself, it's not a terrible thing to have insecurities about your partner, to want to make sure that they're on the same page that you are about things like boundaries with the gender that you're attracted to, or what you feel infidelity means, talking about things like emotional infidelity and so on. All of us may feel jealous at some point or another, and that by itself is not necessarily a red flag for our ability to be healthy partners to other people. When it becomes a red flag is when that person's insecurities become your responsibility. It's not just that they're discussing with you something that they feel insecure about, and they're letting you know that this is something that's going on for them and they're working on it, but that they are demanding changes in your behavior or assurances from you in order to deal with their insecurities. I don't know if anyone has seen that post online where somebody's like, I found it, the cure to my anxiety. I just need to have all my friends like message me every 5 minutes to tell me that they're not mad at me for the rest of my life. This sounds really extreme and ridiculous because it is, but many times when we're talking about jealousy in relationships, it can feel confusing. A lot of times I've heard people talk about, well, it made sense that this person was insecure or jealous because they were cheated on in a previous relationship. And while it may make sense that that person has some insecurity and some triggers around that issue, it doesn't mean that like, because you're their new partner and this thing happened to them before, you can't speak to your coworkers of different genders without having to explain yourself, or that you need to give them a rundown of where you go every day in order for them to feel secure. Those are examples of that person making their insecurities the responsibility of somebody else, rather than working on healing from those traumatic experiences themselves. The next thing that I want to mention is that it might be very subtle. It might not be that this person says, oh, I think that you've been up to no good at that, work party that you went to, or during those 3 hours that you weren't responding to texts. But you might notice that this person behaves differently. There's a pattern after you spend time with friends. Like if you go see friends and you're not with that person, and then the next time you interact with them, they're kind of sulking, they're giving you the silent treatment, or they're picking fights about unrelated things. That's concerning, because that's again that there's this pattern happening where it's making it more difficult for you to continue having a social life and a community outside of the relationship. And oftentimes people will unconsciously decide not to do things, not to call that friend, not to attend that gathering, because they know that there's going to be some kind of unpleasant behavior on the other side of it. And that is that person behavior making their emotions your responsibility, even though they haven't explicitly told you, don't go out, don't see other people, stay home with me all the time. Some of the things that can be really extra concerning are when they are making these kind of baseless accusations, where sort of innocent interactions that you have to have with your coworkers, with people you're interacting with at shops, and at the grocery store to make a purchase, are becoming like fixations for them, where they're deciding that you must be flirting with this random person, even though it was a very innocent interaction, where they're actually constantly putting you on the defensive of having to prove that you're not being unfaithful, or that you don't have a crush on somebody outside of the relationship. Those are really serious red flags where it would be appropriate to really pause and not continue the relationship with this person until and unless they're able to address and change that behavior. I use this guilty until proven innocent example because this is something that comes up a lot with people who are coming in with the narrative of, oh, I've been cheated on in my past relationships, and so I need you to behave a certain way in order for me to proceed and feel okay. This is the idea that you are automatically guilty simply by sharing a gender or some general characteristic with this past partner, or simply by virtue of being the new partner of this person, that now you constantly have to prove yourself as being better or different from the past partner. That's not a healthy place to start a relationship for anybody. In a new relationship, we should be getting to know each other, discovering each other, and figuring out if we are compatible, if we have the same values, if our life goals are compatible or on the same page. Not trying to prove to each other that we're not the reincarnation of some past person. And the last really serious red flag, and this is a red flag whether or not this is accompanied by any kind of controlling or abusive behavior, it's just a red flag for a relationship in general, is if this person has some really serious double standards. So they're very jealous of you interacting with people outside the relationship, but when you have insecurities or concerns about their behavior with other people, those are brushed off or even turned around on you to make it seem as if you're trying to control them. This would be really concerning. And part of why I say also that it's important to break and not proceed is not just because you want to stop and then see if they'll fix the behavior, but because when you see their reaction to putting brakes on the relationship, that in itself is going to give you a lot of information about how likely this person is to be able to address the problems in their behavior. And I say to be able because The kind of behaviors that cause a person, the kind of issues that cause a person to behave this way usually stem from stuff really early in their life. And it's not necessarily that they're out here trying to be a villain. And I also say this because when we're interested in someone and we're attracted, it's really hard for us to think of them in these terms, like either they're good or they're bad, either they're safe or they're dangerous. That's confusing and it's actually unhelpful. But if we can think about whether this person is able to be a healthy partner to us, if they're able to address like difficult or harmful behaviors, that's going to be much more useful information, because we don't have to decide that they're a bad or an evil person in order to realize that they're just not able to be a healthy partner. And that can be a little bit easier to understand and accept and act upon than trying to kind of determine, like, are there too many red flags versus green flags? But just, are they able to address their red flags? It's a little bit easier to think about. So green flag obviously is when there is trust in a relationship, but also when you're starting a new relationship, you're building trust together. So the expectation is not that you should both trust each other 100% right away. That would also be an unrealistic and unhealthy expectation to have, but that you're both allowed to build trust at a pace that's comfortable for both of you. The partner should be aware that any insecure feelings they have are insecure feelings, but they're not evidence that you did something wrong. We can sometimes have different ideas about what appropriate boundaries are with other people. And that's one of the things that we're negotiating in a relationship to figure out if we're compatible. It's okay to have different ideas about what boundaries are appropriate, but it's not okay to vilify your partner for having different boundaries than you, and to, instead of deciding, okay, we're not compatible because our views on this diverge so much, but rather that you're demanding that they change their boundaries, or else they're like an evil, bad person who's not trustworthy. They should be happy to see you enjoying your time with friends, family, or colleagues, and you should be able to be happy for them as well. Again, within those caveats of, that both of you are comfortable with the boundaries you have with other people. But it's good to have a community. It puts a lot of stress on relationships when we're the only people in each other's lives. We're the only support for one another. We want our partners to have healthy relationships with other people. That means that there's going to be less stress on us and more support for them when we do run into difficulties. And finally, you should both be able to express insecurities to each other and discuss your boundaries together. Any questions related to that topic that we're seeing? So moving on to the past. This is a big one in relationships, particularly as we get older and we have more of a past to discuss or not discuss together. This can be a really good sign, one way or the other, of what's going on with this person and how likely they are to be able to be a healthy partner who can grow together with you. So history problems, you're getting pressure to disclose everything about your past right away. It's like that same double standard of, in order for me to trust you, I need you to trust me 100%, but I need all your information so that I can trust you like this much. That's a concerning approach to take. We have a lot, even if we're getting together right out of high school or during high school, we live a lot. You cannot possibly recount every moment of your life to another person. And so we're all naturally going to have things that we share in the beginning, things that we share later, and things that we don't even think about until something reminds us of it later on. So in the situation where there's some red flags, is that when you disclose something slightly later, it's portrayed as you hiding something or being untrustworthy. And this would be very noticeable, particularly if sometimes it's not even a detail that has to do with like a past relationship or something significant that might be significant to a new partner, but like just because you didn't tell them about your your childhood hobbies, they're like, well, if you held that from me, what else are you hiding? And it's especially important to check in with your sense of time at this stage, because often somebody who tends to do this is going to also be doing this kind of love bombing, monopolizing of your time, so that you may be hearing from them, oh, you've been hiding things from me. You didn't tell me about this sooner. But then if you go home and look at your calendar, you find out, wait, we've only been talking for like 3 weeks. How would I have like told them everything about my life at this point? So if you see these things coming up, oftentimes it can be a sign to investigate whether there's some other red flags going on. It's also important how the person talks about their own history. Is it full of crazy exes? Are they constantly the victim or the hero in all the stories? Or is it left completely blank? Now, many of us may be coming out of bad experiences. People may be having experienced abuse in previous relationships. So having negative things to say about past partners isn't by itself a sign that something terrible is wrong with this person. But what's concerning is when there's a pattern and when there's no nuance. So when there's no bit of talking about, well, here's something I wish I did differently in that relationship, or I still am confused about this previous relationship, but it's just very clear, like all of them were terrible and I really got hurt. And, I don't know why, because I'm great. Like this kind of very flat story would be a concern. And again, double standards. If they're demanding more of your history than they ever provide of yours, if they are very suspicious of your history and kind of interrogate you for lots of details, that's concerning. And it's also concerning if when you ask questions about their history, it's kind of like vague or shut down, or the subject is always changed. We all have different levels of comfort with talking about our past. So it's not that everything has to be exactly the same all the time, but if you're getting pressure to disclose more, it's a really bad sign if you can't seem to get that same information back. So what would green flags be for history? Talking about your past as part of getting to know each other and happens at your own pace. And there's an understanding that whatever you share with each other about your past is voluntary. We're not required to give people a list of all our past partners and or if we had past partners, or every last traumatic thing that happened in our lives, and therefore which kind of issues we might be facing in the relationship. We're not trying to interrogate each other. We're trying to get to know each other. It's also a green flag or a good sign if when they talk about their past, it's nuanced. When they talk about past relationships, if they have them, they're able to notice or talk about times when they weren't that mature and they messed something up. That's a good sign. And it's also a good sign if heavy topics are treated with care. So if there's something that you didn't feel comfortable disclosing earlier because it was a difficult thing to talk about, that their response is to be appreciative that you share it with them and not to accuse you of hiding things from them. Any questions on that one?
We have another question, and it says, "What are the parts of history that should be discussed?" I think it means like the past relationships and stuff.
So I'm really not keen on giving like a blanket list of things that should be talked about in the past because it really is so different for each person. I think what we want to make sure we're talking about with our partners is how our past influences us now. So whatever that means for each of you would be important to discuss. And again, it's going to have to be at the pace that you're building trust with this person because these are very personal topics. It might not be appropriate to want to discuss all of these things on a first date. And yet in other contexts where people know that they're talking to each other just to assess if this is a potential marriage partner, maybe they would bring up some of those topics at that point. I would focus potentially less on previous relationships and more on what their expectations are for the future relationship. And similar to it with a job interview, what they think their and what you think your kind of strengths are as a partner, and what are some of the things that you feel like you are still working on. And then on along the lines of what you're still working on, what are you doing to work on those things? You know, have you been engaged in therapy? Have you been doing research on like how developmental trauma potentially impacted you? It's not that therapy is the only thing that you can do, but we want to know that both of us in entering into a relationship are interested not only in finding a healthy partner, but in being able to address things that might not be quite right as they come up. I think some of the future slides are going to get a little bit more as well into how to address the different kinds of flags. So I hope that will also help to answer this question a little bit. So last category of red flags to talk about today is this codependency or isolation. I mentioned before that it's not actually great or healthy to be completely dependent on each other for all your emotional and tangible support. It's actually just overwhelming considering all the things that we need to deal with in today's society, from jobs to family responsibilities, not only caring for children, but caring for parents and siblings and so on. We do need a community. So red flags would be if you appear to be the only close friend of this new partner and their only source of emotional support. Sometimes that might happen due to circumstances beyond the person's control. Maybe they just moved to the area. Maybe they have gone through some kind of really serious event in their life that made that change. But it's important to kind of be aware of that and not to encourage that situation to continue. So you might be their key person at some portion or point in time, but you want to also know that they're making efforts to make connections with other people and that you have room to sometimes not be there to when they need to vent, because you can't always be like constantly available for that person. Further down the spectrum would be you start to function as their teacher, therapist, or parent more often than not. That's going to be exhausting for you, and it's also not going to be a nice way to set the stage for intimacy and trust and playfulness in your relationship. It changes the power dynamic, and it can be confusing too, because sometimes you may be in a relationship with someone who is controlling or potentially abusive, but because you've been pulled into this kind of caregiver role, they kind of are able to paint it that you have more power in the relationship because of how dependent they are on you. But in fact, what's happening is that that guilt is being used to maintain power over you. And then the reverse is also true. If this person kind of appoints themselves your therapist, teacher, or parent, and again, like you may come into a relationship after coming out of a really difficult experience, something bad happened, something serious happened, you just moved countries or states. So it's not bad in and of itself if the person is providing a little extra emotional support for you during that time, or is helping you navigate the new country or the new state or the new environment. But when they don't want to relinquish that role, or when they are frequently using that role to tell you that they know better what's good for you, that's very concerning. And then a major red flag is that if their opinions of your community, your friends, your family, etc., tend to be negative. This can be couched as being protective of you, but what it does is that it chips away at your ability to feel comfortable in those other relationships. And it's also unfair because many of us have complicated families. We may even have complicated friendships that are not always perfect and conflict free. We're not always there for each other the way we like to be. They're not always there for us the way we wish they were. But usually, if those are relationships we value, we are accepting of some of those variations. And a partner who kind of is willing to write everybody off at the first juncture is somebody who is also effectively isolating you from your community and your other supports. Green flags are that they have good relationships with other friends and family and are actively working on building community with others if they are in that situation where they're new somewhere and they are kind of separated. They share their problems with you, but not only with you. When you're not available, it's not an immediate crisis. They're supportive of your relationships with your community. And they encourage you to, to spend time with other people because they know that that's something that benefits you. So now I've mentioned many times that red flags are time to pause and reflect and address it. But how can you address it? So the first thing that I want to highlight is that you have to consider how serious the flag is. If it's very early in the relationship and it's a very red flag, it can be a sign to just not proceed any further with that person. You don't have to work with every single person on addressing all of their difficult behaviors. What you're evaluating is whether it's safe, appropriate, or rewarding for you to proceed with this person. And also, it doesn't have to be the reddest flag in the world for you to decide that you don't want to work through those issues with that person. We all have different levels of capacity and ability to work through these kind of things with other people, especially when we consider our own wounds and difficulties that we're struggling with. And it is not always appropriate or valuable to sit the person down and talk to them about the red flag in their behavior. But if you are going to do it, if you really want to address it with this person, and if you feel that it's kind of an appropriate balance of green flags in the relationship plus one reddish, orange, pinkish flag, you want to make sure that you choose a calm moment to bring up your observation. So one example would be sometime not when the partner is sulking, not when the issue has just happened, but you say, I've noticed the last few times that I went out with my friends or I went to see my family, the next time I spoke to you or the next time we saw each other, you seemed really down. You seemed kind of grumpy with me. And that really kind of hurt. And I'm just wondering what's going on and see how they respond. Um, you always want to keep it very simple and emphasize how you feel when the behavior happens. This is the same kind of advice around using I language that you hear from all kinds of relationship coaching, and it applies here too. It's a good communication practice and it helps to reduce defensiveness in the person who's responding. That said, be very, observant about their response. If they get very defensive right away, if they have an explosive emotional reaction, those are signs that it will be very difficult for this person to safely address and change their behavior. And that's an additional red flag for you, because if you can't work with the person on things that are not going well, then you don't have hope of red flags, becoming less and green flags becoming more. Finally, you really want to set your boundaries. Claim some time for yourself to process and their response or the behavior that happened, and consider when or if you want to proceed. It's really valuable when we are starting a new relationship, when we're not living with the person, when we have fewer eggs in the basket with them, to take that time to really evaluate and go slow. It doesn't mean that you're always going to be perfectly protected from the person having, red flags that didn't come up earlier. But at least if you're addressing things that are concerning as they arise earlier in the relationship, you have a good chance of seeing these kind of responses and noticing whether this is somebody who can work and communicate on their behavior with you.
We have a question.
Sure.
And then, okay, so it says, is a guy getting mad at you for asking him hypothetical questions a red flag? Hypothetical questions about what his expectations are for the future and things like that. And then we also had a response from somebody else that said, I would personally be curious as to why he or she is getting mad, to understand where it's coming from. But if they continue to get mad, then it would be concerning.
Yeah, I would agree with that response. It was very well put. You can have a little curiosity in the beginning, provided that it's not unsafe, the person isn't, or that you feel like it's safe enough to ask the question if you want to. But I would be concerned that somebody's response to you asking questions that you would normally ask to get to know somebody is anger and defensiveness. Now, part of why I don't like to make blanket statements is because I'm not there and I don't know how the questions are being asked. It's possible sometimes for the same question, depending on how it's being asked and in what order, to come across like kind of an interrogation. But provided that that's not what's happening, you're just trying to generally get to know each other and what they might do or what their values might be in a different situation, then yeah, I think anytime that you're trying to communicate and connect with somebody and their response is hostile or dismissive, those are red flags, because you don't have a relationship without communication. So if you can't communicate, like there's really nothing there. But if there are other times where you feel you are able to communicate and you want to explore further, you could have some of that curiosity about, like, why were these questions in particular triggering for this person? And it might not tell you anything that makes you want to proceed with that person, but maybe it will just give you some information or food for thought in general. So on the subject of addressing red flags, promises for change are not in and of themselves helpful or reassuring. they need to be backed up by action and actual behavioral change. So, promise, even somebody who says, all right, like, I know you think I have some problems, so I'm going to sign up for therapy. That's a bad sign, because they're not even taking responsibility for that something is going on that they need to work on. If they are in therapy, but now that's kind of like, that's the end of it and you shouldn't have anything else to ask from me, that's a bad sign too. What really, when somebody signs up for therapy, what you're hoping is that they're going to be getting some support to work on the things that they need, so that it becomes possible for the two of you to discuss and deal with concerns in the relationship. So if the various efforts to change or promises to change are actually being used to shut down your requests or your demands for respect or boundaries in the relationship, then that's actually a red flag in and of itself. Also, it really matters how red the flag has gotten. The reason why I talk about whether people are able to safely address their behavior is because even when somebody really wants to change and they are doing the work and they know that there's a serious problem and they're taking accountability, sometimes their issues can be serious enough that it's not possible for them to just within like 2-3 months or even a year stop engaging in unsafe or harmful behaviors. These are things that people have learned to do from very early on in their lives. They learned that behavior is what was going to keep them safe or was going to get their needs met. And so no matter how much they may want to do what is required to be in a healthy relationship with you, it may be really either an insurmountable barrier, or they may still be an unsafe partner for a significant period of time. And you really have to prioritize your own safety first. Finally, context matters. Obviously, how somebody behaves when everything is going in their wrong in their life versus when everything is going right are very different things, and we ourselves are not always at our best, but it's not an excuse. So you want to see if when stressful things happen, if it's kind of treated like, well, because I'm stressed, this is just what you can expect from me. This is just how I'm going to be. Or if it's that, I've been very stressed. I've noticed that I've started doing these things again. I don't like it. And this is what I'm going to do to work on it. Those are two very different conversations. Finally, I'm being a little glib here by saying, what if I'm the red flag? Red flags are behaviors. They're not whole people. And part of why it can be really difficult to evaluate these things is because we're interacting with a whole person. We're not just like scoring their behaviors on a card. But I really do want to highlight that a lot of us have not had healthy relationships modeled to us in our families of origin. A lot of us have been through significant developmental and interpersonal trauma in our lives. A lot of us, actually, I think most of us, did not get any type of like education on healthy relationship behavior when we were growing up, like in school or in any kind of formal setting. So it's not reasonable to expect that we're all going to go out there and we're just going to be great, healthy partners from day one. So the first thing I want to remind us of is that if you have been in a relationship for a while with somebody whose behavior is reflected by those previous slides, like love bombing, codependency, isolation, alternative version of history and so on, that can be extremely destabilizing, and we may find ourselves engaging in behaviors that we wouldn't have otherwise. That doesn't mean that you are necessarily engaging in red flag behavior, but it means that The fact that you've been driven to behave in these ways is telling you something about the relationship and about your health within the relationship. If you do recognize your own relationship patterns in those red flag descriptions, it doesn't mean that you're doomed to repeat them forever or that you were bad or unlovable. You can actually move beyond them. And as much as I said, it can be very difficult, when you're willing to do it and you get the right support, it can happen a lot faster than you may think. This is a topic for another day, but the starting points would be that you need to understand the role of developmental trauma and attachment so that you can understand why you might be having these outsized emotional reactions to things that are not necessarily a threat. You need to prioritize safety for yourself and also with other people. So if you are somebody who's been engaging in unsafe behaviors with a partner, then you may need to remove yourself from that relationship until you can really get a handle on the things that are triggering that behavior from you. You definitely will need to seek help. The kind of trauma, the kind of wounds that happen that to cause this type of behavior in people happen in relationships, and they cannot be healed in isolation. This is one case where I say you absolutely do need therapy, and there isn't another option that is going to work just as well. You absolutely need to heal these kind of problems within a safe, contained relationship where there are some clear boundaries. And that's not going to be the case with the relationship with friend or family or a partner. And most importantly, you do need to hold yourself responsible for your emotional well-being. So that means that you need to take care of yourself. Oftentimes, people who are engaging in these kind of behaviors are trying to get their needs met by being in relationship with others, and they haven't really learned how to take care of themselves. And so you really have to work on building up that ability before you can be a safe and healthy partner with someone else. So now we can open it up to further questions. I tried to boil things down in the presentation, but real life and relationships are much messier and more confusing on the inside. So if you feel comfortable, given that this is being recorded, please let us know any questions that you feel like have been left unanswered or maybe have been sparked by the presentation so far. And Tamanna will share them from the chat, or you can, I believe, also raise your hand or unmute yourself if you'd like to speak.
You can unmute and yeah.
Yes, I see. So Husbu, you've raised your hand. So I've unmuted you if you'd like to share your question.
Yeah, I just want to ask, well, first I want to say thank you so much for doing this presentation. So I just want to emphasize how important this content is, just because I feel while growing up, I don't think this was taught. And so even though this is kind of more focused on I guess romantic relationships, I do want to say I think this is also relevant for any interpersonal relationships.
Absolutely.
The burning question I have, so I know you mentioned that there are other ways instead of just therapy to go through to work through and process your own personal wounds and stuff, so you can be a healthy person for someone else. What are I may have missed it, but what other ways, what other routes are there besides just going through therapy? I love therapy, by the way, but I just want to know what other routes there are.
Sure. So I do want to emphasize that when I'm talking about some of these serious kind of developmental or attachment wounds that make us unhealthy or unsafe partners to other people, I really do strongly recommend therapy, because you need that safe relationship to be a container to work through those things. And that is also going to make sure that you're not harming other people in that meantime, or if you're somebody who engages in some types of self-harm or risky behavior, it's going to help make it a safer process for you to address those kind of traumas, which can be really overwhelming to address on your own. However, a lot of the same things that work for kind of general self-care and support can be helpful for a lot of people. So if you're, if you, for some reason, you don't have access to therapy, or at least not good therapy, but you want to take some steps in the meantime, if you're having a lot of issues in relationship, the biggest thing that you can work on is your own ability to self-regulate. So working on things like those grounding techniques that we, like a short one that we did in the beginning, or engaging in hobbies or activities that are going to help you feel more centered and calm more of the time, is going to help those big emotions feel less overwhelming, so that when you do read books, there are all kinds of kind of self-help workbooks out there, and there's no particular ones I recommend at this time, but there are a lot of things out there to just help you understand what might be going on if you've had a very traumatic childhood, or if you are behaving in ways that are concerning to you or to other people in your life. It's going to be very important to have some things that give you support and give you a sense of safety, so that when you address those things, it's not completely overwhelming. And that can be any type of thing. People talk about horticultural therapy, gardening, equestrian therapy, like, riding horses, whatever you have access to that is enjoyable to you and is helps you to be on more of an even keel, is going to give you a better foundation for engaging with difficult or serious inner questions in your life. There's in particular a modality called dialectical behavioral therapy. And although, again, I think you'll have the most support if you work through this with a therapist or in a therapeutic group, there are DBT skills workbooks out there that are designed for people to be able to work on their own. And, trying to do things on your own can also be a good way to explore whether it's possible, or whether you really need to find a therapist. And even if it's going to take a little while to locate that person and access it, that it's important to do that. So any other questions from the group?
Thank you.
Oh, and
We
you're
have
very
another
welcome.
question. Sorry. We have another question in the chat. It says, when confused about whether one is being unfairly treated or not, how should one verify it?
So if you're feeling confused and disoriented in a relationship, and you're wondering whether it's fair or unfair, good or bad, reviewing some of these kind of red flag, green flag things is going to be important. It's also going to be important to look at kind of your own behavior and emotional responses. And again, working on some of that self-regulation is going to be helpful, because some of us have really serious trauma responses anytime we're vulnerable in a relationship. And so it can just feel confusing no matter what's going on the other side. But I would say that if you're feeling very confused in a relationship, it's time to reach out for some help. It doesn't have to be therapy right away. For example, Pillars of Peace has a helpline. I say it's a helpline. That means that it's active 9 to 5, but we're not always answering it, but you would get a response within 24 to 48 hours during the business week if we didn't answer it right away. And Tamanna Our case manager is really great at talking through with people what's going on, figuring out if there's kind of safety issues and helping to kind of parse those things, because usually when you're in the relationship, it can be very disorienting. And if you're just asking your partner, they have a stake in the question. And even other people in your life might feel like they have a stake in the game. So talking to a therapist or a professional at an organization like ours is going to help you get some of that outside, more neutral perspective. I hope that answers the question. Unfortunately, it's not. You do need to talk it through. You do need to do some investigation, but feeling very confused and disoriented would be, a sign that you need some time to process and maybe some time away from that person as well.
We have a question that says, do we provide one-to-one consultation? The answer is yes. We have case
Yes, you do.
management by me, and then also just me, and I think there's one other person that's offering like therapy for victims of gender-based violence. And
So
it is
currently,
remote.
So currently it's just me, but I am offering trauma-focused therapy in Arabic, English, and French. And those are all individual sessions. Unless we have, okay, I think I see some. I say a little bit of a follow-up on the question of dealing with therapy or when there's kind of stigma around mental health. So the reason why I do suggest that people access other kinds of resources is precisely that. Like if people are not going to engage in therapy, I want them to at least get some of the help that can be out there. And so I would say like dialectical behavioral skills therapy that is designed, the workbooks and so on that are designed for you to do on your own is a really good start, but also just any type of engagement that is going to help with grounding, self-regulation, and like informative educational discussions like these that help people to kind of see what's going on in my relationships? What's going on in my own behavior? Is there something that I need some support on? And, where can I get that? There's quite a lot of information online. Sometimes it's too much and it can be confusing or contradictory, but I would say that just engaging more with kind of self-awareness, self-reflective, and self-care materials is a good place to start. And I think I'll move on to the next slide just because we're coming up on 7 o'clock. So unless there's, okay. So if you have any other questions, if you are somebody who's trying to figure out what's going on in your relationship and you're not sure, please reach out to us. We're very happy to talk it through and help people to kind of even figure out what is going on here. Should I be concerned? Should I not be concerned? And part of why we talk about addressing gender-based violence kind of holistically is because we know that even when people are not sure that they are a survivor or that they're currently in an abusive relationship or have been recently, a lot of us have grown up with some type of trauma or abuse in the home. And that counts too, because it makes it that much more difficult for us to figure out how to have healthy relationships as adults. So on that subject, we have some additional programming coming up. So tomorrow, even later, unfortunately, at 6:30 p.m., we're having a presentation on narcissism. It's not just discussing what the narcissistic personality disorder is, but also kind of what have been the public and mainstream conversations around this, and how helpful is it really when we're trying to figure out what's going on in our relationship and what else might be helpful. And some things to look out for that have not been, that haven't started yet, that are not announced yet or on the calendar, but will be soon. We'll be having an additional webinar probably in the weeks after Thanksgiving on attachment styles. And we will also be sending out registration info for a 6-week program to start in the new year for adults anywhere from 18 to 35 who grew up with some kind of domestic violence in the home. And if that's something that interests you and you're not quite sure if you're eligible, still reach out to us. Again, we're very happy to talk it through. And we're offering that specifically because we see that this is something that's true for a lot of people in this community and others, and that there's kind of been limited attention and resources put into it. For adults, it seems like there's been a lot of attention to kids and people who are already dealing with it, abusive relationships as adults, but less kind of like emerging adulthood. And this is how you can contact us. We'll stay on for like a few more minutes for anybody who have some last minute questions, but otherwise we really look forward to seeing you at our future events and hearing from you if you'd like to reach out to find out more about Pillars, to get involved, or to get additional help or information from us. That's what we're here for. And of course, as Giving Tuesday is approaching, we should also mention that any donation to Pillars of Peace is tax deductible, zakat eligible. I believe there's a link directly from our website to donate, and it would go toward ensuring that we're able to offer services to the broader community, to survivors, that are completely free. And, we hope as well that we can continue to expand the amount of services that we're offering. Thank you all again for joining us. I'm going to close out the recording. But I was so happy to see so many faces and names on the list today. And I hope that as we have different types of programming, that you'll continue to join us in the future. And somebody asked if the presentation will be shared. Yes, that's why we're recording it. So once this is over, I'll download the recording and then we'll be posting it online, and we can share it with all the participants as well.